All right, welcome everybody to the Learner-Centered Collaborative podcast. I am so excited to have Henry Turner joining me today. Henry is an award-winning high school principal and nationally renowned speaker. He's most proud of the collaborative community he works with to empower students to fight hate and bigotry in schools. Pointing to his unwavering commitment to equity and a student-centered culture, Henry was named 2020 K12 Principal of the Year by K12 Dive. He shares his experience as an innovative instructional leader, passionate advocate, and committed anti-racist educator with educators and organizational leaders across the United States and beyond. Henry, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here and excited to dive in with you today.
Katie, thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to chat with you.
So I always like to start off by turning it back to you and just having you share with all of us a little bit about who you are. What are some of the key experiences that you've had that have shaped you to be the educator and leader that you are today?
Sure. So thanks for having me again. And I guess I'm one of those few rare individuals that knew what they wanted to do at a young age. And I knew that in high school that I wanted to be a history teacher. I was really inspired by some of my history teachers in high school. And also I was one of the few students of color in my school. And so I lived in I grew up in a family that is multiracial, African-American dad and white mom. And we talked about race all the time in my family. From our experiences that we had, and also just in terms of talking about societal issues, and so really both of those kind of parts of my history growing up really centered in my commitment in education. And when I graduated from UMass Amherst and started teaching, I was really looking for communities where that were similar to the one that I grew up in, where I could really make a difference with students of color, and also that I could help the community learn how to talk about race and racism, which was ever present. But what I found growing up was that I certainly had the skills to be able to talk about difference, to talk about and to connect with people who are different from me, and to learn from people who are different from me. I learned there were a lot of people who did not know how to do that. And so I thought that as a teacher that was certainly a part of the social studies curriculum and helping to develop those skills. And more grew passionate about helping students to to be able to learn about the diversity of our society, to learn about people who are different from them, and to stand up to injustice. And that's something that was also a core for me as an educator, and really pushed me to becoming an administrator when I got the leadership bug, and got to do some really exciting work as an assistant principal in the community that now I'm currently principal. That I got to create an AP program for really geared towards students of color and low-income students, and how to help them to succeed in a classroom where very few of them, and there had been a significant disparity in the school. So I saw some of what success looks like. And then as principal at a small school in Massachusetts, we faced some significant anti-Semitism in the district, and when we had a swastika in my school, the decision we made, actually against some of the advice of other colleagues who are outside of the district, was that we communicated to the community about it. And as administrators, we were taught, like, if the student doesn't see it, then don't share it with the community. And we just thought that was just not right. And what I learned by sharing this incident was that the community, our Jewish community, felt supported by that and felt seen. Right? They were saying to us, this stuff has always happened. We know it's happened, and now someone is actually acknowledging what we've seen. And that resonated with me as a person of color. And so when I returned to Newton, as principal of Newton North High School, my third week on the job, we were faced with students driving around with a Confederate flag. And that incident, helped me to, was one that we quickly condemned, but also learned that for our students of color, they felt disconnected in the community. We learned that actually that our Black students felt that they had a connection with an adult or a student in the building at a 30% lower rate than white students. And so, we quickly moved into, supporting these students in terms of their voice, in terms of their how they want to feel connected in school. And also as we as adults to start to adapt our instruction to meet their needs. How do we build relationships, really get to know students at a foundational level? And then
Now
how
we're
do we
talking.
change? Yeah, exactly, right. And how do we change policy? And
Yeah.
that really, it all kind of it all parallels with connects with my experience growing up. And I feel like
Yeah.
that's sort of like what has centered me.
I can hear that throughout each of your stories. I can hear that starting from conversations with your parents about race and injustice and equity and how you've had those tools, right? And I think that's a lot about your work is, you have to have the tools to be able to lean into those conversations and to affect that change at multiple levels. And, as you're talking about being a history teacher, I'm thinking about, my experience so often was so surface level. You just hear about few key figures throughout history. And I remember thinking like, racism was the thing of the past, or you hear about, Martin Luther King, instead of really looking at who we are and what's happening day to day, and also learning about so many other people who have affected change or been part of history. And I love that you as a history teacher were able to bring that in and have those hard conversations with your students. And hopefully, I'm assuming, help them to have those tools to have those conversations in their own lives.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that what really really excites me is when we start talking about like what do we want students doing, right? And
Mhm.
that really centers us on the student-centered type of learning that we want in our classrooms, right? With that, it's not about necessarily the content. The content is certainly important, but it's like what are the skills we want students learning? And what I believe, what my vision is, that we want students to develop leadership skills, right? We want them to stand up to injustice. And that's where I really push back against sort of some of the arguments that's going out there in our political sphere that talking about privilege is forcing white students to feel bad about themselves. It's actually helping people who have privileges and advantages to learn how to become upstanders. Like that's what we want, right? It's the same way with bullying. We want students to really develop the skills to stand up to injustice when they see something wrong, to stand up for it, stand up
Right.
against it, excuse me. And I think that's really where we really need to lean in as educators. So I appreciate the connection, because I agree that it does connect with what we're trying to teach in history class.
Right. And like you said, what we want students to know and be able to do and the experiences we want them to have. When we think about, you mentioned like people felt seen and valued. And that's part of my vision as well, is that everyone can feel seen and valued for who they are, what they bring, their experiences as part of a community. And what an amazing atmosphere and community can be created when everyone comes to the table recognizing the differences, but not seeing them as things that separate them, but also strengths that bring the community more diversity and can learn from each other as well.
Totally. And what I love about your work is that you write a lot about the idea that learner-centered excites kids, right? And that's what we find, is that when we can center it on what they want to learn, they're going to develop a passion. And what we've found in our school is that when students, for example, the Confederate flag incident, is that when we put the power in the hands of our students, like what is the change that you want to see? They created a rally. Within that week, they created a rally that had 500 attendees. And they learned that their voice will be heard. They also developed the skills of how to organize. And when I look back at those times, I actually was reminded of it a few months ago when an alum came back to speak at our school, and she was speaking about sort of imposter syndrome that she was experiencing at this large public university that she was at. And she was in a statistics course, and she felt like, am I in the right place? Can I do it? And she found herself, not only could she do it, but she learned that she knew it so well that she was actually doing better than most of the students in the class, and found herself, as a young woman of color, found herself tutoring two white males. And she reflected on the fact that, wow, this is a significant moment, that me, a woman of color, tutoring two white males. And she said, that's great. I'm so thankful for my statistics teacher to help me out. But I learned, I thought, this is not about your statistics teacher. They certainly prepared you for the math, but this is about sort of the skills you learned in school, right? This student helped to organize our George Floyd protest at our school. She was able to, she developed leadership skills. She was able to talk about race and racism. And so all of those skills helped her to not only be able to tutor these students, but recognize the moment and the importance of it. And I think that's what success is, right? When people ask, what does an anti-racist school look like? To me, that is success. We have a long way to go in my school, but I, with that experience, I got to see, what success can look like.
Yeah. Well, I was reflecting as I was thinking about our conversation and kind of our journey as friends and colleagues. And I remember we met, I can't remember the exact year, at ISTE, like 2015,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah,
I
right
think it
about
was in
then.
Denver. I think you had just finished your dissertation, and we were both presenting on research studies and connected and have been in contact, here and there at different conferences.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until June of 2020. I had been doing a lot of reflecting, and I wrote a blog post on kind of the events after George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery, and kind of reflecting on what it meant to be anti-racist. And I posted a graphic, and this is in my journey to be more reflective. I posted a graphic, and I was putting my thinking out there. And the graphic was one of overt versus covert racism. And at the top, what was socially acceptable versus what was not socially acceptable. And very quickly, you responded in a comment, and you pushed in, like kindly but directly in the comments about struggling with the idea of this being socially acceptable, and what that meant and who sees it as socially acceptable. And I remember just being flooded. I remember sitting here at my desk reading that comment and being so embarrassed, so full of shame for, oh my gosh, not even seeing that. Because as soon as you pointed it out, I was like, of course, this is not, this doesn't make sense. And this only perpetuates the privilege that it's trying to dismantle, as you shared. And as after I stopped hyperventilating, I think I reached out to you and I was like, can we talk? And you were so kind, but not not letting me off the hook. And those are the tools you're talking about, right? You were direct and challenging and helped me see and really urged. I was like, I'm going to erase it right now. And I think you urged me to leave it up. And so I did. I left it up and then just put the comment, that I'm still learning and growing. So one, I want to thank you for that. That was definitely a hard moment, but I'm grateful to have a colleague and a friend now who would be able to challenge me, but also really be able to support me in that journey. So one, I just want to thank you. But also kind of like there's been a lot that you've been called to do in the last couple of years. How have you grown in this work, and what are some lessons maybe that you have for others for how to engage and step into that conversation?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I also, I also wanted to say that's a great example about how I think, from my perspective, I think from your perspective, that we've gotten closer
Yeah.
because of that moment, right? And
Mhm.
how these conversations actually are not meant to divide us, actually to unite us, right? And even when they're uncomfortable, they help us to grow and understand different perspectives, and that
Yeah.
that is the work, and that we're not, you know, that there are people who I struggle with who are resistant to this work, but there are people who are I struggle with because they are, they're trying to win the anti-racism Olympics and, judge people for, and but are not reflective of themselves. And I think that, kind of tied to your question is that, uh, that when I was asked to, kind of share my ideas, around the work that we were doing in our schools, that I think the critical, misstep that a lot of educators were doing was not incorporating reflection. And there were a lot of educators at that time and prior that, just thought, I read a book, and so therefore I'm going to go straight to action. And what they ended up doing was creating more, supporting racism as opposed to dismantling it. They ended up, hurting their relationships with students as opposed to strengthening their relationships. And so, what was exciting, for me was, during a very challenging time, was that, uh, I started to kind of process the work that we have been doing as a school. And, we were about in 2020, we were, the school's been doing a lot of work around race for a long time. I had been principal for about 4 years at that time, and, really thought that we had learned some things along the way, um, that I think could be helpful for educators. And, there's a lot of books that are out there about, how to do your own work, your own equity work, but there's not a lot out there for leaders. And that's really my passion, is, how to help leaders to create change and to improve their organization. And so, um, that sort of writing and reflection conversations I had with friends and with colleagues, really led to, realization that, maybe I have a book in me. And so that's when, I started to do some writing to start thinking about, whether that's possible.
Well, and for those who don't know, Change the Narrative, your book with Kathy Lopes, is it Lopes?
Lopes,
Um,
yep.
is out and is that great resource. So maybe if you share a little bit, you started to share kind of why you wrote the book, but how are you seeing it affect change in schools, and what are some of the conversations that people are having now that this book is out in the world?
Yeah, I think the question I'm regularly asked is, how do you get this work started? Right. There are a
Mhm.
lot of educators, a lot of principals, a lot of, superintendents and administrators, who are, who really want to start equity work, but they don't necessarily feel like they have the confidence to be able to do it. And there are, and to my earlier point is that there were a number of school leaders who just went straight into action right away. And, and many of them called me afterwards and said, we had equity as on our school improvement plan for the year. And I said, well, how did it work out? And like, well, we're exhausted and we haven't made much progress. Right. And so it's this question of like, what does leadership mean in leading, with a diverse, equity, inclusion mindset? Um, and so that's really the frame of the book, is to help leaders, regardless of your role, whether you're, a classroom teacher, whether you are, a building administrator or district administrator, to help, you to do your own reflection in terms of where you are within systemic racism, and to recognize where it exists in our school, and then some tools to be able to lead, your organization that way, and then also to build consensus and to, help bring people through change, whether it's through policy work, or whether it's, in terms of how we interact with each other as colleagues, how we, strengthen student voice, how to make changes around curriculum and instruction. All of those are different, how we work with families and communities. Those are all different areas where we touch upon in the book to help, people feel confident in leading it. And I think the result has been, we've gotten a lot of really good, feedback. We've gotten, a lot of, schools and, districts, reaching out, wanting to, have their leadership team, their administrative team read it. And also we're seeing, a lot of, professional associations, principals, superintendent, school committee associations, reaching out because they want to kind of think about how to prepare, leaders to be able to lead in this work, particularly where we're facing a lot of resistance, and a lot of people who are, a lot of, politicians and others who are, trying to, manipulate, um, equity work, and trying to, prevent this kind of work happening in schools.
Yeah, so many things I want to push into on here. So I think the first thing that I think is really important to reinforce is, you said this work is not meant to be divisive, right? Like when you're really leaning in and really trying to understand people and create a space where everyone feels valued and welcome and has access to opportunities, it is meant to create conversation. It's meant to lean in and learn and build those bridges and connections. And so often there's, full of shame and lack of understanding, and it creates that divide. So what are some like strategies you have, or just ways that you think about when you're starting these conversations or where you're engaging with people, so that we can be more inclusive and build the bridges rather than really tear them down?
Yeah, so I think that, so divisive. I want to just push back a little bit on sort of the idea of divisive, because I think
Okay.
that we do want to stand up for values,
Sure.
right? And so I think that, the most important thing that school leaders can do is, really establish what our values are. And we hear so many mission statements and value statements that say, we support all students in our school. And yet, when we take a colorblind approach, right, we're actually going to exclude, our most marginalized students when we make those kind of statements. And so we have to be really explicit about what our values are. And if our values are that we're going to see the unique, ness of our students, we're going to understand the societal impact on students who are traditionally marginalized, and we're going to stand up for them, then you're going to confront pushback, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what the system, that's what racism is. That's what, homophobia is, right? Is that if we're going to stand up for, students who are traditionally marginalized, that we're going to be confronting something. What I think we want to do, though, is to help people to see, that when we are inclusive, that it's actually good for everyone.
Yeah.
And so, one of the first things that we did in our school that I think is a great first step, because I'm hearing now a lot of, in the wake of sort of the political backlash, of DEI work, is that there's a lot of administrators saying, what is something small that I can do to help get more people on board? And I would say that, a great step that you can take is just have a panel of of students come to a faculty meeting. So we had, a group of students of color, come and share their experience, of what it's like to walk down our hallways. And it was very brave of those students, right? They were really honest. And it helped, educators to, realize that, that our students walk down these hallways, with a different lens, all different lenses. And so that's data to be able to help those who are really resisting, to be able to see that, there's work that we got to do. If we really care about all kids, then we have to see that, some kids don't feel connected. And another thing I think you can do really, if you say really quickly, the other thing I think you can do is, what are the ways in which you help students to feel seen? And so I think the easiest thing that we ever did, was that we allowed, students to be able to write their name phonetically in our student information system. And so on the student, roster, day one, teachers can pronounce their names, correctly. It was, there was no push, there was no pushback at all for that initiative, and
Right.
and people loved it.
I love that, Henry. The first one, student voice, having students come and share and develop that empathy for their experience. Sometimes from our lenses, our own, we don't see what they actually experience. So powerful on so many fronts to do that. And knowing a student's name, saying it, hearing your own name is so powerful. And what a great strategy. So, you don't have to have students feel awkward about it. And teachers on day one can pronounce their names and acknowledge students. I love that. Two really, really great strategies. The other thing I want to ask you about, you've mentioned equity a few times, and equity and anti-racism, it goes hand in hand. But a lot of times when I hear people talk about equity, and this is kind of where you pushed on me, and I appreciate that, is it's everyone gets the same thing. So if we see equity, or we see all of our policies as all of the kids getting the same thing, so it's equitable, then that means that the most marginalized kids don't actually get what they need and they get lost. And so how do you frame equity when you talk about this? What does equity mean to you? I know what it means to me, but I'm curious from your standpoint, how do you talk about it?
Equity to me is kids get what they need in order to meet our high expectations. And so Pedro Noguera, I think, has one of the better quotes, which is, in summary, that we need to have high expectations for students and recognize that they follow different paths to get there. So that doesn't mean that everyone's going to get equal, but they're going to get what they need. And so we need to develop strategies, instructional strategies, building-based strategies that are culturally responsive and designed in a way that it meets the unique needs of students. It doesn't mean that 25 students in a class get 25 different lesson plans. It means that we need to create a structure for students to be able to have a different pathway so that they can meet your expectations.
Love that. And I think too, when teachers or anyone hears, I have to personalize this now, when everyone gets something different, that's not sustainable. But I love how you framed it is, and I think National Equity Project talks about it that way too. Every child gets what they need to reach their full academic and social potential. And so that does mean various systems to support. And for me, when I think about that, it's agency and ownership, that we have to hand some of that to students. We have to give them the tools, we have to give them the support, but we can't be the one to always do it for each and every student. We have to bring them into the conversation, just like you started by saying, let's hear their experiences. Let's hear what they need, rather than it being all on the teachers or the leaders.
So totally agree. I think so. We've worked a lot with sort of Hammond's book, Culturally Responsive Instruction in the Brain, and she uses the ready for rigor concept of the warm demander. And we have asked educators, actually, in fact, I've had department chairs who have used the warm demander chart to, after observation of a teacher, to have them reflect on where they are, how they see themselves as a warm demander. And I think that if you are equity focused, you want to be culturally responsive, and that you get to know students, that students build trust with you, that you are supportive, that you are flexible in how you support students, but you also are a demander, that you have high expectations for students. And we write in the book that that UDL is not necessarily anti-racist unless you use the equity race-focused lens to incorporate that design. And I love Katie Novak's work, because she really does help to bridge that work, that we need to be culturally responsive, see who our students are, and design our classrooms so that students have different pathways to get there, and different levels of support to get there.
Yeah, two of my favorites of Katie Novak and Zaretta Hammond, both of their work really, really influential. But I think that's an important distinction. And we talk about this a lot at Learner Center Collaborative and in Learner Center practices, that your outcome matters, right? These are all strategies and practices and frameworks. But if your outcomes remain that, everyone reaches a certain standard, you might be standardizing the practices instead of creating more personalized pathways. So thinking about anti-racism, equity, UDL practices, all of that for me, and I'm curious to get your perspective, is around the learner at the center, right? Like their identity, who they are, all of that is at the center, and all of these practices and strategies help to elevate that individual, their identity, their skills, to be able to help them on their path forward. But so often we don't backwards design from those practices. And so we kind of miss the point in implementing some of these programs and strategies, in my opinion.
I absolutely agree with you. And I think that, it really goes back to this idea of reflection, right? How well do we know our students? I think every educator wants to have strong relationships with students. And so therefore, if they're not reflecting, honestly, they may just think, yeah, I build great relationships with my students. But what happens when they say to a class, we're reading Huck Finn, and what do you want to do? Do you want to use the N word or not in Huck Finn? And students vote, and let's say it's a majority white class, and students vote, yeah, let's use the N word. Well, are you creating a safe environment? Are you building relationships with students? And you may say, well, I'm giving them student voice, right? So you're using this colorblind strategy to that actually is further distancing you from your students, particularly your most marginalized students. And so if we really are taking this approach of how are we going to center our learners, we have to really know who they are. We have to know their backgrounds. We have to know how society places them because of their identities, right? And recognizing that if we're truly going to move past talking about race, we actually have to talk about race, right? And so we have to see that some of our students come into our classrooms not feeling safe because they haven't felt like safe in a classroom before. And so if we're going to give student voice, we're also going to say there are some non-negotiables. Like, we're not going to debate whether the Holocaust existed. We're not going to talk about whether slavery is good or bad, right? We're going to make some decisions to make sure it's safe for all. That's learner-centered, right? Not just having a lack of structure. That's not student-centered. You really have to kind of think about, what are your expectations? What are the ways in which all students are going to feel safe in my class?
Well, and that goes back to what you said earlier about values, right? Being clear about your values and what you're going to stand up for and what the expectations of the group are. Then you can start to have those conversations and be warm demanders and have those hard conversations, but being really clear on the values and what you're going to tolerate or support and what you're not. The other thing, as you're talking about Huck Finn, as a former, English teacher, I'm also thinking, gosh, we got to really look at our reading lists. We got to really look at, what do we have in our libraries, and what are we offering to young people to read? What are we encouraging them to discuss and think about, and moving away from just these, typical books that have been in our schools forever. That was one of my favorite reasons, or ways to teach the English classroom, is creating book clubs and having people read about different perspectives and histories, because ultimately that's the goal. Not that everyone reads Huck Finn or that everyone reads Beowulf, but really that you can read and you can think critically and understand multiple perspectives. From my point of view, that was always my goal.
So one of the places where people have gotten the most excitement in our book is this instructional leadership chapter, where we give some different exemplars of educators and some tips on how to engage with those educators. And one of them is the teacher who believes in only teaching the classics, right? That I'm going to just teach the classics, and that's what's important for kids, is for them to have read these books that I think are the classics. And kids feel less connected, they feel bored, they don't see themselves in the curriculum, and you're the one defining what the classics are. And so therefore, you're really not creating an inclusive environment in your classroom. And so what I've been really excited about and seeing in both in our school and in other schools around is people who are doing lit circles, right, where students get to choose the books that they are interested in, and they get to discuss it with others to help be the expert on this book with others in their class. We created a course that I think was really exciting, is Action Through Literature, which is a sophomore course, which is where state testing occurs in our state, and it's an option for students to take. So it's their English course, and it helps students to develop social justice skills through the literature that they're reading. So the books that are chosen are really focused on a diverse range of protagonists, but also empowered protagonists, right? That help students to develop these skills. And I think that when we incorporate those kind of strategies, we really help students to feel connected, to feel seen, and to be excited about reading, right? That's the goal of an English class, is to help students become lifelong learners and to become passionate about reading. And so, I think that when we also talk about how you choose your curriculum, and if you
Mhm.
just say, I want some diverse authors, and you layer it on top of the classics, then you're actually not creating a place where students are going to feel seen. They're going to feel like they're just an addition, right? We really have to ground our courses when thinking about our content, and making sure that our students feel seen. And that's in a math class or an English class. I've seen math teachers who are, developing problem sets to make sure that students feel seen, to make sure students are feeling empowered. And I really push back that there's one department that is the most um, rigid in a high school. In fact, in every school, there's a different department that says, like, I can't teach diversity in my class. And then there's another school where that same department is leading the way in this work.
Yeah, it makes me think about, you know, asking teachers or asking leaders to create more diverse classrooms, reading lists, anything that they're studying. It really requires educators to do their work first, right? Because if you aren't aware of many of the injustices in the world, or you're not aware of multiple perspectives, you haven't read diverse authors, then how in the world are you going to be able to open that up to your students? And a lot of times I think we get stuck, and this is maybe not intentional, and maybe some, is you teach from your perspective. And if we're only teaching from our perspective, we're not teaching students the skills to be critical thinkers. We're not asking them to empathize with one another and engage in those conversations, which I think is probably one of the most needed things in our schools more than ever now, is for people to be critical about what they're talking about, to really interrogate news sources or what people are saying, and not just take everything for face value.
And this is the leadership, right? I mean, this is
Yeah.
where we want educators to ground themselves and to do some reflection of where they are in this work before they can they can act. And so we're Kathy and I are just are about to send out a one of our podcasts that is focused on um, why does learning and reflection take so long, right, is really the question. And we really have to be thoughtful about what is best, what's going to connect students, right? How are students going to feel seen? And that takes a long time for you to really reflect on, sort of, do I have great relationships with students? What students don't connect with me well, and why is that? What do I need to do? Have I asked them what I need to do in order to build stronger relationships with them? Do I really understand their culture? And then, like, what are ways in which I can kind of adapt everything I learned into the classroom? That takes time. And so sometimes this work takes more than a year, right? And it's not a year of inaction, it's a year of real intense reflection that I think is critical for all of us. And the way to lead in this work is to model that, because I think sometimes we read a book and we think we need to just bring it into the classroom the next day, and we end up failing and feeling like we can't do this work and the work feels too big.
Yeah. And I want to go back to one of the first strategies you shared about, the student panel, bringing students in as educators in the classroom, asking students about their perspective. And then there's a few books, but, where the teacher doesn't have to know everything.
Mhm.
If you create the space where kids feel safe and they can share about their culture, or they can have projects where they can research people who look like them, sound like them, or that they're interested in, careers they care about. There's many things that the teacher doesn't have to be the expert, but we do have to be open and willing to let young people bring themselves to the curriculum and really be part of it, instead of just having the pacing guide, having the books we've always done. It's really about figuring out who is in your classroom, what are they curious about, and how do we bring those in so that we can reach those high targets that we have. They can coexist, and I think that is the core of learner-centered practices. But it takes a different mindset about the role of the educator or the leader in the school building.
When I work with aspiring principals and school administrators, around curriculum and evaluation, supervision, evaluation. And one of the first questions I ask them when we do an observation of the classroom is, who's the show in this class? Is it the teacher or is it the students,
Love
right?
that.
And who's doing the work? The student should be doing the work, right? I think the educator who spends months and months and months creating this one activity for students, and the students do it in 45 minutes, right? Like, the work should be reversed. The student should be doing the work, should be doing the depth, really the really deep thinking, critical thinking, and creation. And that as educators, we should be there supervising, supporting, right? We're there to help them to grow. We're not to have the most beautiful activity to assign students, and then they kind of do it and they move on. We want our activities to be memorable for students. That means that they've got to do the work. They, even when it's rigorous, even when it's puts them outside their comfort zone, we want students to be doing the work and for us to be the one who's supporting. And as administrators, we should be similarly not giving all the answers. When we do an observation, we should not be saying, well, you should have done this, and this, right? It really needs to be helping the educator to be reflecting on their own practice, right? It's about helping them to really kind of own their learning.
Yeah. And I think that's the piece, is you put people on the defensive when you're saying you didn't do this, or you should do X, Y, and Z. No matter what we're trying to teach or coach or guide toward, it's about having enough humility to be able to engage in a conversation, but being that warm demander about what are our values, what are the things that we're holding tight to, and how are you working toward that. I think it's a really important skill that not enough people have, which is why we're not having the tough conversations and the important conversations we need to have to move forward.
Yeah, and I think that this just really comes back to the idea that who's the dominant culture that we're reinforcing. And so when 80% of teachers are white, 80% of administrators are white, and more than 50% of our students are students of color, right? We have to think about what culture is dominant here. And when we take an administrator heavy approach, when we take a teacher heavy centered approach, then it's going to be a white centered approach in most classrooms, right? When we allow our students to feel empowered in the classroom, to feel empowered in the school, to own their learning, to feel challenged, right? It's creating a more anti-racist notion. So I would say, again, similar to the UDL, that learner-centered instruction is not inherently anti-racist, but it should be, right? We should be seeing who are the diversity of our students, the skills we want students to learn, and recognizing that we're not the show as the teacher or as the administrator, that it's about our students and helping them to feel seen.
Yeah, and I think that is our hope, is to make that clear that I don't see how you can be learner-centered without being anti-racist, because if you are not centering the learner and who they are, like you said, their culture, their values, their identity, then that is at the core of the work, and it's important to understand. And I like the question you just reminded me of, like, who isn't being valued in this classroom? Whose perspective isn't being elevated? And it's an important question to ask of all of us as we're designing learning experiences, as we're designing, professional learning for educators, to really think about whose voice isn't being heard, who isn't being supported or seen. And that's kind of something that I try and think about, but should also just keep at the forefront in all of the work.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think I guess what I meant by learner-centered is that I think there's a lot of educators who think that they're learner-centered,
Oh,
right?
100%.
They're not seeing, they're trying to not see race. And so
Yeah.
therefore you're not, so I agree with you, you're not being learner-centered. And so we have to really recognize that when as a teacher, if I say I teach the way that I learned when I was a student, and 80% of our teachers are white, then you're bringing a white dominant culture perspective to your classroom. When we say, I want my classroom to be a place where students learn and feel challenged and feel seen, right? Then we really need to know who our students are. And we need to design our instruction in our lessons focus on them. So I agree with you that if we do it from that perspective, then learner-centered has to be, anti-racist.
Yeah. So I want to ask one more question before we get into rapid fire. You talk about in the book, you actually kick it off with the cycle of inquiry that you talk about being cycle of reflection. So can you share a little bit about this cycle and how educators can really use this to think about their practices and move forward?
Right. So we think that the way to one, do your own work and thinking about your own place in in racism within our structures of racism within our school. And I'll just say the way that we defined, and we've used the definition that racism is a system of advantage based on race, which goes all the way back to the 1970s. So when we think about how do we dismantle the system, we have to do our own work first, and then we have to help others to do this work as leaders. And so the cycle of inquiry of learn, reflect, act, and assess, we thought just helped to slow down the action, because we don't want to just move, I learned something, I moved straight to action. We know that can strengthen racism. We also know that it can be, it can create other problems as well. And this is not necessarily a race-focused analogy, but in a few years ago in a school that I was working at, we did a workshop on formative assessment software. And the next day, students were just like, eyes were buzzing as they're walking down the hallways, because they're like, every teacher is using this new software, right? It's like we as educators, just like we learn something, we want to put it to action. And when we think about dismantling systems and structures that have been a part of school throughout the history of schooling in the United States, we have to take a careful approach. And so I think the cycle of inquiry really helps us to, one, learn about ourselves, learn about racism, learn about our students, reflect on how all of that works together, and what are some of the ways in which we can dismantle the system of advantage based on race, what action is going to do that, and then once we've implemented it, that we should be assessing it, right? And I think that's a place where we always fall down in schools, is that we go into action and then we never check to see if it's actually working.
Right.
And so thinking
I
about,
love that example of the formative assessment too, right? It's like everyone does something and we think it's great, but we don't see how collectively the actions impact students and how we need to work together.
exactly.
All right, it's time for rapid fire. So first question, what is one thing we should stop doing in education?
Okay. I would say one thing we should stop doing in education is just adopting buzzwords from from research or from corporations or from wherever, and actually think about what actually is going to work for our students. And I'm just coming out of teaching a supervision evaluation course, so I kind of have SMART goals on my mind. I think that SMART goals were just adopted from corporations, and it just really has hurt how we think about stretching ourselves. Sorry, that's not a rapid fire answer.
That's a good answer. What's one thing we should start doing in education?
I think that we should start doing more peer observations and seeing what our peers are doing in their classrooms, and realizing experts are in there.
I love that so much. What should we keep doing?
We should keep innovating.
We should. All right. You finished the book, and but I know you always have a new project. So what are you focusing on, or what are you learning right now?
So I'm doing a lot of leaning into this idea of assessment, and how do we know that this works? I think with a lot of schools struggling with even starting this work, there's a lot of pushback that's happening, and saying that when we focus on equity, we're diminishing academic excellence, and that is wrong. And I think that we need to come up with really clear ways of assessing our work to demonstrate that anti-racist work is good for all students. And then I'm doing some great work with other educators with some and with schools, and I've got a great newsletter that's going on. So still doing some writing, connecting with educators, helping them kind of think about how to get into leadership around equity.
Awesome. Good stuff. We'll make sure that everyone gets access to that newsletter if they're not already on the list. What's one thing that many people don't know about you?
Wow. Well, I was a college swimmer. That's maybe something that people know me. And my wife, we met because she was a college swimmer at the same university. So.
And many people probably don't know that our significant others are from the same town, which is crazy.
That is crazy.
Okay. What are you grateful for right now?
I am grateful that this summer I've gotten to spend a lot of family time. With COVID being a school administrator, there's been a lot of nights over the last 2.5 years where I have not been out and about, or I've been out and about working and not at home. So I'm grateful that this summer we've gotten to reconnect as a family. It's been important.
Awesome. And last question, one hope for the future of education.
What I hope is that there are more voices that are heard in education than currently are now.
Awesome. Henry, thank you so much for your time, for your work, and for being a courageous, warm demander as a friend and colleague. I appreciate you and so glad to have you in my network and excited for the work that you're doing more broadly.
Thanks, Katie. It is always fun chatting with you. We have so many overlaps, and so I love our conversations, and so I'm glad we were able to actually record this one. So that's very exciting.
Yeah. Well, enjoy the rest of your summer, and thank you for being here.